Here is a tweet of yours that I want to ask you about. Can we pull up that tweet? There you go. You say, you love Donald Trump, but you don't trust the people he has surrounded himself with, such as Tim Scott, and you refer to Lindsey Graham and Rick Grinnell in some unflattering terms, and you also don't like Nikki Haley and former never-Trumper J.D. Vance in his administration. Well, J.D. Vance is now the vice presidential nominee, so your ominous omen came true there. But I just want to ask you, why do you love Donald Trump so much? I mean, why do you preface any criticism of Donald Trump with a proclamation that you love him? I mean, why love a politician at all? Donald Trump is a 3-time presidential candidate, arguably even a 5-time presidential candidate if you count his toying with running for the Republican nomination in 2012, and then in 2000 he ran as a Reform Party primary candidate against Pat Buchanan. So he's now a career politician essentially. And I don't know. I'm not inclined to declare my undying love for any politician. So I'm just curious why it is that you tend to precede any critique you might have of Trump with this reaffirmation of your love for him.
Well, I think you have to consider that Trump is a pretty unique figure in American politics. And I actually probably tend to agree more with you lately. I know we had a pretty strong disagreement on Twitter earlier this year, but I'm certainly closer to your camp at this point. But I would say that I always preface any criticism of Trump. I mean, first of all, it's a political reality that he is the most popular Republican in the United States. And so I think just from a purely tactical point of view, for somebody like myself, I don't necessarily want to alienate myself as a right-wing commentator from most of the Trump supporters. That is a big part of it. Let's just be honest. But more than that, Donald Trump is who initially inspired me to actually become an America First nationalist or America First patriot. My show, you said you don't know what my title is. I host a show on Rumble called America First, and I got the name from when he used that expression in his campaign and in his inaugural address. He said, "A new vision will govern our land. It'll be only America first." And so this is where I think there's a little bit more complexity maybe than some people are willing to admit, where before Donald Trump came into the party, conservatives said that America First was a KKK slogan because of the historical roots, of course, of that phrase with Charles Lindbergh and Henry Ford and others. They said it's an anti-Semitic slogan to even say that. And I think that when you look at over time what Trump has done as president and what he promises to do in a future term, you're absolutely right. And I've said as much on my show, there's a major contradiction. His first term did not live up to that standard. His policies now don't live up to that standard. But if it weren't for that initial campaign in 2016, this contradiction would not be forced. And so now America First has been set as the standard. And that was not the case before he came into office. Before, during, and now even after his presidency, you see that the Republican consensus or status quo is neoconservatism. And you see people like DeSantis and Haley, you can even draw a distinction between what they say versus what he says. And you're right, it's not 100% America First. I have my criticisms also. But it's not the kind of insane rhetoric from people like Haley that say, when it comes to Israel, we just need to say, what do they want? When do they want it? No questions asked. Biden has effectively done that also. Trump would probably be doing that as well. But certainly it's a different standard being applied. And so I think there's like a dialectical argument to be made that, you know, again, even if the practical application was not lived up to at all, it has given a lot of young people and I think a new generation of Republicans the kind of ideological tools or dialectical tools to say, are we living up even to America First? So I think that was a really important thing that happened regardless.
Okay, so I want to go to an image. This is Sheldon and Miriam Adelson in February of 2020. So let's just pull up that image for our viewers' reference. Okay, so there's Sheldon Adelson, the late casino magnate, and his wife, who has now inherited his fortune and his political project. And this is in 2020, okay? So in 2016, Adelson funded Trump to the tune of approximately $25 million, giving to a super PAC. In the 2018 midterms, Adelson, whose singular issue is pro-Israel, okay? He cares about nothing else, at least in terms of his political giving. Even when he was divorced as a younger man, he told his associates that he wanted them to find him an Israeli woman for him to remarry, and they heeded that call and found him one. And he's even now buried in the Mount of Olives in East Jerusalem. So that's Sheldon Adelson's political project, okay? So that in 2018, he gave to Trump in 2016. He gave to the Republicans in 2018 in the midterms, one of the top funders of the entire Republican Party and of the Trump coordination with congressional Republicans. And then in 2020, he again became one of Trump's chief funders. So I raised that because after the 2020 election, you led something called the Stop the Steal movement, or at least you were a galvanizer or a rallier for the Stop the Steal movement because you were just so desperate to keep Trump in power after 2020. There's you and Ali Akbar, also known as Ali Alexander, who were some of the main organizers of that effort. And this is after Trump took all these millions from the chief funders of the cause that you now say you object to, which is orienting U.S. foreign policy inextricably with Israel. And Trump even says that he did this at the behest of Adelson. Trump was addressing a Republican Jewish coalition gathering last November. You say his rhetoric is different from DeSantis and Haley. I mean, not really. Trump said at this Republican Jewish coalition donor gala, he pointed to Miriam Adelson and said, your husband was so great, we moved the embassy to Jerusalem because he really wanted it. So I guess my question to you is, I understand that you have these criticisms of Trump now, but all this was evident while Trump was actually in power. And yet you were putting your, I guess, reputation on the line via this Stop the Steal. I think it was kind of a sham, no offense. Where did all that money go that was given to Stop the Steal? I mean, Trump fundraised out the wazoo for Stop the Steal. Desperate Republican voters were filling his coffers with money on the idea that he could switch the delegate slate in Georgia or something. And I don't know, I guess, are you having an epiphany now that you now repudiate what you were doing in 2020 to keep Trump in power? Or do you see the contradiction that I'm trying to highlight here?
Yeah, well, and like I said earlier, I think it's a bit more complicated than you're letting on. And I would say that the rhetoric is different. And I'll address that first very quickly. After the October 7th invasion, Trump used it as an opportunity to criticize Netanyahu. And he said, actually, that Hezbollah was smart for their attacks on Israel. That doesn't sound like DeSantis and Haley. And I don't think that's a negligible difference. So I'll just put that out there in the first place. I'm getting a little echo in my ear. If we could, there we go. So that's the first thing I would say. It's a not negligible difference for Trump to say, well, it's really bad public relations. They got to wrap it up as soon as possible. Netanyahu should be investigated. And of course, there were reports that in private, he was very vengeful about Netanyahu's acknowledgement that Biden won the illegitimate election in 2020. So there was public and private statements, I think, that were not insignificantly different than the others. That's in the first place. In the second place, I think I and many others were under the illusion after the first term that Trump primarily had a personnel problem, because you're right that Trump, I think, got in office and did not want to let go of Afghanistan for those reasons, like about pivoting against China or something. But Trump did order a drawdown in Syria twice, and the generals basically ignored him. So I don't think you're being totally fair. One of the first things that Trump did when he got in office was ended the regime change policy against Syria, April 2017. And there were some symbolic strikes.
He bombed Syria twice.
I know that.
Well.
I know that. April 2017 and April 2018. He bombed Syria the first time a week after they officially changed the policy and said we no longer seek regime change against Assad. Rex Tillerson,
by the way, do you remember this? He bombed Syria the first time, reportedly, because Ivanka showed Trump these heart-rending images of victims of one of the chemical attacks that were attributed to Assad. And Trump said, sure, let's go ahead, bombs away. That was supposedly the impetus for why Trump bombed Syria. But that's just an aside.
Well, Supposedly, but we could also see that the first strikes came during Xi Jinping's formal state visit to the United States, and he was sleeping in a bedroom at Mar-a-Lago. And if you recall, the first thing that Obama told them to do was negotiate with North Korea on denuclearization. He was pursuing what I believe was the madman doctrine, a deal with North Korea by threatening fire and fury and deploying aircraft carriers into the Pacific. And so if you look at the context of where those strikes came from, one, they were telegraphed in advance. There were no casualties. The airfield that they struck in Homs was operational within 24 hours. So, I mean, we could relitigate that whole strike. I believe that was a symbolic show of force to reestablish deterrence with Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago to leverage that with trying to get him to assist on North Korea. But that's besides the point. So he ended the regime change policy in Syria. He ordered them to draw down twice. And the first time, the Pentagon slow-walked it and were lying to him about the troop totals. Second time, they ignored it altogether. And then, if you'll recall, in 2020, John McEntee came into the personnel office, and this is what I was trying to get at here. Many of us were under the illusion that Trump wanted an America First foreign policy, but that the personnel was interfering. The generals, the Pentagon, DOD, potentially people like John Bolton who clashed with Trump. I think that also had to do with North Korea, but whatever. And so McEntee comes in 2020 to the personnel office. They totally clean house. They're hiring and firing a lot of people. I think that's why a lot of things started to turn around. Not everything, but some things in 2020. And there's also a big story, which you leave, these are key details you're leaving out. The generals ignored the order to draw down. They ended regime change. And then shortly before or during the lame duck period, after the election, McEntee was distributing a direct order from the president to withdraw troops, not just from Iraq and Afghanistan, but from Germany and South Korea as well. That was something that was widely reported about this big shakeup that McEntee led. So, there was kind of like a different mindset back then. Now I'm a lot more cynical about Donald Trump himself. And I believe that the problem might belong more to him than a lot of us realized. At that time, we said, and I think not without basis, that he was being sabotaged by the deep state and they're slow walking things or ignoring him. Now I think it's clear he's far more of a willing participant than was maybe clear at that point. So Stop the Steal, one, I think we were a lot more optimistic about Trump himself, but two, there were other issues going on as well. And it's fair game. People say, well, you're a huge critic of Israel. Trump is the most pro-Israel president. How do you square these things? But I've always said there's multiple issues. And the big concern back during Stop the Steal was forced vaccine mandate, vaccine passports, rolling out of digital ID. And and Glenn knows that's a pretty big deal. And it's something that's resurfacing now with Vice President Palantir and this Keir in the United Kingdom. They're huge advocates of this global ID stuff. So that was a big concern with Biden coming in. That's number one. And I know that Trump was somewhat of a participant too. And number two, the big concern was social media censorship. And there was a last-ditch effort in 2020 to change out some of the guys on the FCC to reinterpret Section 230. You got to remember, before Rumble and before Elon acquired X, we were cooked. It was over on social media for free speech. And we thought the only remedy would come from government, and that would only come from a Republican administration. So those are really my two major imperatives.
Okay, yeah. So I do think it's notable that you now are at least more willing to concede that the primary problem, such as there is a problem, may actually lie with Trump himself and not these personnel who lots of right-wingers who are America First or MAGA or what have you would always kind of conjure up a narrative about how these interlopers were sabotaging Trump or tricking him or manipulating him. You saw this recently even when Trump gave his blessing to the passage of the National Security Supplemental in April, which included the largest ever disbursement of monies to Ukraine and also $26 billion to Israel. The same line was rehearsed, even by Steve Bannon, Jack Posobiec. All these people were saying, oh, gee whiz, once again, Trump has been snookered by Speaker Mike Johnson. The blame never seems to get allocated to Trump, the principal. It's always somebody else. But you're sort of breaking the mold there and saying that you do have a critique of Trump individually. And on the point of how Trump was lied to about the troop totals in Syria by the military brass, I agree that report did come out. But look, I mean, it's nothing new for the military brass to fudge statistics as they send them up the chain of command. William Westmoreland, the chief general in Vietnam, lied out of his ears about casualty figures and the progress in Vietnam to Lyndon Johnson. David Petraeus gave a massive slant to the figures that were being sent to Barack Obama about that first surge in Afghanistan in the first Obama administration. So the idea of having a competent chief executive is that you have to navigate all these pressures that are coming at you, have a bit of discipline, have a bit of principle, and then you can buck whatever deceptions may be emanating out of your subordinates. But Trump clearly didn't have the interest in doing that. So the idea that Trump is absolved of all culpability because some no-name apparatchik might have tried to mislead some superior on Syria figures, I think is a bit of a deflection, but I otherwise acknowledge your point. I do want to bring up a video here and have you react to it. This is Trump at his estate in Bedminster, New Jersey in July of 2023. Let's roll that.
We mourn the destruction of the Holy Temple that happened thousands of years ago. Jewish people around the world still mourn this great loss, and every year during the 3 weeks we mourn, and when it comes the big day of Tisha B'Av, we cry, and we have the great beliefs that very soon we will be Zoiche, we will all see the building of the third temple in Jerusalem very soon. And we honor our President Trump for what he has done for Jerusalem and for the Jewish people. So when we sit here today, we are helping and sending out a message to the entire world, knowing that Jerusalem is a place that has to be secure for Jews, and we should very soon be able to see the building of the third temple, living with coming of Mashiach Tzidkenu b'mheira v'yameinu, amen. We all have great gratitude to this person. This is a person that doesn't care only for himself, but cares for the entire world, and especially for the people in Israel and for the Jews in America. My blessings may the blessings from Israel come upon the president, his family, and all his friends. May God give a long life, a healthy life, a sweet life to our dear president, Mr. Donald J. Trump.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm glad I told him to do that. He did a very good job. You've done that before, Rabbi, I guess, huh? A couple of times, huh? Thank you very much.
Okay, let's leave it there. Trump goes on to receive an award from one of these genuinely extreme religious Zionist organizations. And I'm not even saying Zionist as a term of derision. This is how they self-describe, obviously. And they're heaping praise on Trump because they view him as integral to bringing forth a process whereby the Jews will be able to reconstruct the third temple in Jerusalem. And I want to next bring up this is a screen grab from Trump at the receiving the Theodore Herzl Gold Medallion at the Zionist Organization of America 125th Anniversary Gala in New York City in 2022. There's Trump, full of good spirit, good cheer, receiving the Theodore Herzl Gold Medallion. And that's basically the intellectual founder of Zionism. So this is all before the 2024 campaign. This is long before Nikki Haley or Ron DeSantis were challenging Trump. So my surmise from this is that Trump is actually empowering. Maybe he doesn't rhetorically resort to some of these more flamboyant statements of pro-Israel zeal as others, just because he's not really practiced in it. But he's elevating some of the most extreme elements of pro-Israel fervor, including these hyper-religious elements. I was in Jerusalem myself after October 7th, and you can go and buy a commemorative shekel with Trump's visage on it, transposed over the biblical King Cyrus, because that's how consequential some of these more hardcore religious Jews view Trump in saving the Jewish homeland. So I guess, look, if I take I'm not going to doubt your sincerity in your criticism of Israel. I think we would probably disagree on the basis for our criticisms of Israel. Like, I'm not somebody who is denouncing Israel because they don't accept Christ as king and that kind of thing. But whatever the source of our criticisms, I just don't see why this determination to twist yourself into knots and say, oh, Trump is different from the other Republicans. No, his record is that he's the most extreme. Again, maybe not in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of who he's empowered, who he's elevated, and what he actually did when he's in office and what he's pledging to do again. So what am I missing?
Well, I don't think it is twisting myself into knots for Trump's sake, because it would be far easier for me to say in a very one-dimensional way, I'm the anti-Israel guy, Trump is the pro-Israel guy, I'm anti-Trump. But I think the legacy is a bit more complicated, like I said. And you're right, you could pull up a lot of unfortunate clips that, I don't really care for, when he's got the Chabad Lubavitchers running all over the White House and this kind of stuff, receiving these awards or talking about rebuilding a third temple. Of course, I don't care for that. But let's be very clear. When Trump ran in 2016, in the middle of the Syrian civil war, in which we were involved in, of course, Syrian civil war is part of that clean break report. It's part of that clean break doctrine of taking out Iraq, then Syria, then Iran. And it's all about securing that northern border. Ultimately, probably with the intention of eventually annexing Gaza and the West Bank, realizing the ambitions of the revisionist Zionists so that they can rebuild the third temple. But Trump came in 2016 and changed the orthodoxy. He came in and said, you can't fight two wars at once. We have to bomb ISIS. As we know, Israeli intelligence is all over ISIS. ISIS apologized for striking Israel one time. They never attacked Israel. Israel said we'd prefer ISIS on our border instead of Iran's proxies, which, of course, is the situation now. And Trump came in, and in that first year, he drew down the regime change policy. They tried to get him back in with another fake chemical attack like they did with Obama. He didn't go in. Like we talked about, the Syria strike was really not as consequential as people make it out to be. At that time, I remember guys like Posobiec were saying, June 1st, 2017, 100,000 troops in Syria. Let's just be honest. Those people turned out to be wrong. So he reoriented American policy away from regime change against Assad and to instead bombing ISIS. Was that good or bad for Israel? I think that was probably worse for Israel. Israel preferred ISIS. Trump helped to bolster Assad's control over Syria, which is Israel's mortal enemy. They're still technically in a state of conflict. Is that better or worse for Israel? I think it's probably worse. And so the way that I looked at it and justified it for a long time is that Trump, of course, because it's national politics, has to make a deal with some faction of the Jewish elite. We know that there's a left-wing faction. We know there's a right-wing Zionist faction. They often collaborate and they're often on the same side. But, we understand that there's some degree of factionalism. And so we knew that Trump was going to have to in some way show some fealty to the Zionists. For me, the question was, is this a deal to get the money to get elected, and then in actual policy, he wouldn't be delivering another Iraq war, for example, or wouldn't be doing another Libyan intervention or something like that. And in exchange for that, we get a border wall, we can drain the swamp, we get whatever. And so I guess where I started to change my viewpoint over time is realizing that we weren't getting anything on our side of the deal. Immigration was not restricted. The wall was not built. The Supreme Court justices suck. I'm saying this is like a very right-wing conservative. And, we could go down the list, but over time, I began to realize it's a very lopsided deal. Very conservative Republicans aren't getting anything. Trump didn't really live up to his promises on the three key issues, which were trade, immigration, drawing down the troop presence in the Middle East. And on the other hand, Israel was getting more and more, and the same neocons were being brought back in, and the same, what I thought at one time were oversights or, mistakes, people were being brought back, like you showed in that tweet, people like Haley and Grinnell. And, I heard a tip that Vance was in contention for the VP. When it became clear that he was going to be the guy, that was kind of it for me, where I realized, like we said earlier, it's not bad advice. It's not that he's being misled. He seems to be a willful participant. And the reason why for so long I was willing to give him the benefit of the doubt is that he truly was an unknown quantity. He was a political outsider. His rhetoric was very different and extreme in 16. He came in without infrastructure. As you know, the personnel was selected by Reince Priebus and Chris Christie and a number of others. And so I was sort of willing to give him a chance, give him some time. One man against the whole system cannot change it overnight. But we're now 8 years on. The rhetoric has gotten worse. The personnel has gotten worse. And so I'm just sort of sitting here thinking over the past few months, what is it that we're actually fighting for? What is it really about? So that's sort of been my evolving position on it. It has a lot to do with the fact that, you know, when Trump ran, I was 18. And so I didn't really even know anybody and I didn't really get my bearings. So personal evolution over time, seeing the Trump record, seeing him make the same errors constantly, that's sort of what led me into this far more critical position now. But I think you do have, you know, I find myself when I'm with Trump supporters, I'm the most critical, and they're calling, you know, Laura Loomer's calling me a never Trumper. When I'm with somebody like yourself, you say I'm twisting myself into knots. I'm like Bill Mitchell, how he used to be in 2017, apologizing for everything he does. But I'm really just trying to strike a fair balance and give him credit for changing the orthodoxy, at least in a dialectical way, saying the standard should be America first, failing to live up to it for various reasons. Although I don't think the failure is as deep or as one-sided as maybe people like yourself make it out to be, as evidenced by, for example, the policy in Syria. But I do agree with you about Iran.
So let's go to another thing that Trump did in office. This is Donald Trump with Pastor John Hagee in the White House. You may be familiar with this gentleman. Let's go to that image of Trump with John Hagee. It's really a beautiful image for us all to gaze upon. So there's Trump and Pastor John Hagee. We're using my tweet as a reference point, and there they are. So Hagee was a frequent visitor to the Trump White House. Now, I don't think anybody would mistake Trump for being a fire-breathing Protestant Christian Zionist who thinks that the U.S. needs to support Israel because we have to hasten the second coming of Christ and, rebuild the temple and all this, and then have all the believers raptured into heaven. That is Hagee's view. Hagee is actually an accelerationist in the sense that he wants this apocalyptic war, as foretold in the book of Revelation, to break out in the Middle East, and he views Trump as a useful tool for achieving that outcome. And then let's go to the video of Hagee performing an important opening benediction. This is at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem, which Trump, again, boasts that he moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in 2018. So let's play that.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, for those stirring words.
So there's
To now offer a closing benediction, I'd like to call upon Pastor John Hagee, founder and senior pastor of the Cornerstone Baptist Church in San Antonio, Texas. Pastor Hagee.
Our most gracious Heavenly Father, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who calls the stars by name and measures space with the span of his hand.
So you get the idea. So Nick, you get the idea. For one of Trump's signature achievements that he continues to relentlessly tout to this day, and I had lots of Republican members of Congress touting this to me when I was at the Republican convention last week. He chose to name John Hagee, who, I don't know how you could get more extreme and frankly bonkers theologically than John Hagee. Again, he's trying to accelerate military conflict in the Middle East, views Trump as a vessel to do so in order to hasten the second coming of Christ, which he then believes will lead to the salvation of humankind. That's his theology. I'm not exaggerating, I don't think. And so what about forget the Jewish elements of this pro-Israel lobbying class. the Republican Party is basically dominated by people who may not be quite as extreme as Hagee, but they're not too far off in terms of the basics of what they profess to believe theologically. You had a rapturous reception, and I use the word rapture deliberately, rapturous reception among Republican members of Congress for Netanyahu's joint address earlier this week. Netanyahu was just in Mar-a-Lago today meeting with Trump. So I guess I wonder, what would it take for you? Now, I grant Israel is not the only issue, foreign policy is not the only issue, but if this is high up on your issue matrix, as it seems to be for you, what would it take to not just kind of beat around the bush, but actually declare opposition to Trump, right? Or is it just commercially unfeasible for you because it means that a lot of the more right-wing audience that you have would flee? I mean, could you do it if you wanted to and still have a viable business model? I guess that's my question.
Well, my supporters are more loyal to me than Trump, so that's not a concern at all. And that's why I've been able to be pro-Trump at times and critical of Trump at other times, because the people that follow me even more so than they follow Trump. So that's not really the prime consideration. And if you've seen my content or watched my show, I've been extremely oppositional to Trump in the past few weeks, and on every point that you just mentioned, on the visit with Netanyahu and on the, like you said, the speech in Congress on Wednesday, and a lot of these things at the RNC when they brought a Democrat named Shabbos Kestenbaum at the Republican convention who's suing Harvard for anti-Semitism. So I've been as critical as anybody, and even more so, I would think, than almost any conservative on this matter. But again, when it comes to my criticism of Trump, it always has to deal with the real world application. You're showing speeches of, here's an evangelical. There are a lot of evangelical Christians that comprise the Republican base that have this dispensationalist theology. That is, unfortunately, what they believe. I'm Catholic, so I don't believe in that theology, and I'm America first, so I don't believe that we should be blessing Israel based on, this dubious interpretation of the Bible. So, I mean, granted. And what's more, I don't support these Hasidic Jews. I don't support rabbinical Judaism and the guy that you played before and their plan to rebuild the third temple. But these are speeches, and this is rhetoric. And we know that if you go to CPAC any year, even before Trump, you'd see a lot of Chabad Nicks. You'd see a lot of Hasidic Jews. And you know that if you went to any conference past 20 years with Republicans, you'd get evangelical dispensationalist Christians. So I always saw that as that's rhetoric. That's part of the noise. I could play you a clip from December 2015 when Trump spoke before the Republican Jewish Coalition and said, you're not going to support me because I'm not going to take your money. And that means you can't tell me what to do.
And then he took their money.
We know that.
And then he took their money.
I know. But, we do have to consider that Trump at that time was an unknown entity.
Right,
and then in 2017,
but now he's known.
Well, okay, and hang on, and that's why we evolved. That's why we have to look at the actual policy rather than just what people are saying at a given time. And you don't seem to be acknowledging, because I've made the case over and over, the major conflagration that was escalating back in 2017 was the Syrian civil war. And they were looking for regime change against Assad, just like Obama delivered in Libya, just like Bush delivered in Iraq. They were trying to do that against Assad, and Trump held the line, to his credit. He tried to withdraw. They didn't let him. He formally ended the policy against the wishes of Ambassador Nikki Haley. So, you got to give the credit where it's due. And then you got to be critical where it's appropriate
I'll give Trump credit for imposing unprecedented sanctions on Syria, causing a massive humanitarian crisis there. If what you want to give Trump credit for is creating lots of strife and suffering around the world, I acknowledge the regime change thing. Obviously, he departed from his predecessors in ending the CIA-led program to try to more forcefully oust Assad. So I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge the full spectrum of Trump's record. I guess just in totality, it seems like, you're kind of missing the forest for the trees there. But Nick, I want to wrap up with one final question for you. You famously, or maybe infamously, were said to have met with Trump at Mar-a-Lago in November of 2022, along with Kanye West, or Ye. And that caused a huge frenzy at the time. I guess maybe that contributes to why you often profess that you love him. Correct me if I'm wrong. But it seems like you probably couldn't get a meeting now with Trump if you sought one. That's my impression. Am I correct in that? And what does that tell you about the current status of the Trump movement and what his kind of political incentives are now?
Yes, you're definitely right about that. And honestly, I probably wouldn't have gotten a meeting with Trump in the first place. I was only there because I was part of Ye's entourage at that time. And, you know, a lot of people accuse that of me and Ye and everyone involved as setting Trump up. We had no expectation that I would even be at the dinner. You know, I was fully planning on being at a hotel. That's why I was in a hoodie. I would never wear a hoodie to meet the president, especially knowing President Trump. He's always wearing the suit and all that. So anyway, I don't think I would have gotten a meeting in the first place, but it says that just like in 2017, we're reliving 2017, the people that actually ideologically believe in America first, the people that are actually personally loyal are the least welcome around Trump. And the people that are the least ideologically aligned and the people that are least loyal, like Vance, Susie Wiles, Chris LaCivita, Nikki Haley, they're the ones that seem to be closest to him. So, you know, if that's a clean way to wrap it up, that is a big part of why I'm feeling, and it's not me personally, I know I'm a very radical guy, but for a lot of other people like Project 2025, it's very clear in 2024 that, you know, for a long time we thought Trump made mistakes. It's clear that Trump doesn't see it that way. He believes the first term was a great success, and he believes those people that, you know, were around then and betrayed him later are good people. That's part of the problem. And I think a lot of Trump supporters need to have a much more sober assessment, you know, and I think we love the man. We think he's a good man, but that, you know, politics is always a bit more messy than the personal story. People need to get sober about what the real legacy is and who the real flesh and blood people are they're going to be in this next administration. It's not going to be America first. And for that reason, I'm not going to be voting in this election. So that's my closing statement, I suppose.
All right, very well. The closing statement of Nick Fuentes. I think this conversation was fairly illuminating, maybe more than people might have expected. I thought it would be, just because any conversation that I'm in is going to be inherently illuminating. But I hope you found it a useful use of your time. Useful use. I hope you felt it was time well spent and the viewers got something out of it. So Nick Fuentes, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great conversation.